So now let's see how all that applies in actual training. And we're going to start with bodybuilding. Now, unfortunately, sophisticated planning is rarely utilized in the field of bodybuilding. And variation is usually achieved by simply shuffling things around, something known as principle of muscle confusion. And the only more or less accepted way of structuring your training in bodybuilding is breaking it into periods of bulking and cutting. And as most of you probably know, bulking is when you're focusing on increasing the muscle mass, and cutting is when you're trying to maintain the muscle mass while focusing on decreasing the body fat percentage to further display your muscles. Now, as we will see in a moment, this is still very much viable way of structuring your training if it's done properly. But unfortunately, guys usually just talking about bulking and cutting. But in reality, that training stays exactly the same. So let's talk about how this is traditionally being implemented. So when it comes to bulking, during this time, you will be mostly utilizing big compound exercises such as squats, deadlifts, bench press, shoulder press, bend over rows, dips and pull-ups, and so on. Now the reps will be from 8 to 4. Just a quick note here, the reps in bodybuilding is very much a matter of a personal preference, and the only more or less accepted rule is that muscle groups such as forearms, calves, and abs will get higher reps than the rest of the body. Now, during this time, you will be utilizing explosive style of muscle exercise execution, which combined with longer rest breaks should enable you to lift heavier weights. And all this combined with the higher caloric intake should help you to grow muscle mass. Now, when it comes to cutting, now you can also add some of the isolation movements to fine-tune various details of different muscle groups. The reps will be higher from 8 to 15 usually, and you will also be utilizing slower speed of exercise execution, which combined with shorter rest breaks should help you to chase that pump a little more. And all this combined will probably necessitate that you use weights that are lower from what you use during the bulking phase, which is actually very logical if you take into account that during this time you'll probably be intaking fewer calories. Now, this is very much outside of the scope of this video, but just a few words on that topic. So it used to be that back in the days that guys would focus on cutting down on fats during this time, but it seems that the more current trend is to cut down on carbs. Now, there is a lot of nonsense in the field of nutrition, probably even more so than in the field of resistance training, and that's why I decided to take a minute and to recommend a book here for you guys if you feel that you are getting lost in all the information. And the book is Championship Bodybuilding by Chris Ossetto, and I'm probably mispronouncing his name or his last name because I don't personally know the gentleman, but I really like the book. So half of this book is about training, and that part is also very good, and another half is about nutrition, and which I consider to be the most valuable because he gives you very strong basics on what nutrition should look like in bodybuilding, and it also gives you the tools to further evaluate all the current trends without drowning in all the information. Now, he also talks quite a bit about different supplements, but you're gonna have to decide on your own how important that part is for you. But back to this. So even if we were to disregard the nutrition part, as you can see, just based on this is still a very sensible way of structuring your training, because just doing this alone will give you plenty of variation, and it also will keep things mentally fresh. So something that we talked about earlier in this video, because at the end of this block of training, you are probably very much looking forward to taking a break from the bone crushing weights, and at the end of this block of training, you're probably very much looking forward to taking a break from this punishing pace, from feeling the burn, from feeling out of breath all the time. And by the way, this is, if you utilizing my strength and hypertrophy rotation, this is how different those phases of training should look like, should feel like rather. So like I said, this is still very sensible way of structuring your training. So now let's talk about what things are going to look like at the level of a microcycle. And we're going to start with the schedule. Now, I imagine not too many professional bodybuilders are watching this video And that's why I'm going to start by saying that a lot of this will depend on how much free time you have. But besides that, these are some other important factors that you have to take into consideration while designing a training program. And when it comes to bodybuilding, training programs are almost always split routines. So if you're not sure what that is, it's basically you're combining exercises for the same muscle group together. And bro split is probably the easiest way to illustrate it, because in bro split, you come to the gym and you focus on only one muscle group. So for example, Monday's chest, Tuesday's back, Wednesday's shoulders, and so on. And that's probably one of the most rudimentary ways to utilize split routines. Now, another one I don't really like that much is the upper-lower body split. And the reason for that is because if you think about it, when it comes to bodybuilding, there are just many more things on the upper body that require your attention than when it comes to the lower body. And that's why I don't think upper-lower body split tends to be very balanced. Now, it is also possible to utilize whole body routines, and this is something that abbreviated training utilizes. But we spoke about that in one of my previous videos already. Now, when it comes to the frequency in bodybuilding, you train usually 3 to 6 times a week. Now, besides how much free time you have, this will greatly depend on your recovery capabilities. So things that we discussed in my energy budget video. Now, I know that this channel is about getting big and strong without steroids, and a lot of people might be a little concerned with this number here, but you just have to understand that we are looking at the big picture here. So I've been training for almost 3 decades, and it's not like I never trained 6 times a week. And you just have to understand while you're doing it that you are overreaching, and this is probably not something that you're going to be able to sustain for a very long time. Now, while I'm doing it, I also understand that I am probably not going to make any progress during that time or during the time immediately after, because it will take my body some time to fully recover, and only then I will be able to collect the dividends from the high volume, high frequency training that I done earlier. And I think this is something that happens when people switch to heavy duty, high intensity training, because initially they get all these great results and they contribute it all to the new methodology they're using, while in reality they probably just finally got a chance to recover from whatever high volume routine they were using earlier. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to get such great results for a very long time while utilizing such ultra low volume training methodology. Besides deciding on how many training sessions you're going to have per week, you also have to figure out how often you're going to train each body part per week. And in bodybuilding, it's usually 1 to 3 times per week. Now, when you're spreading out training sessions for various body parts on your weekly schedule, it is very important to take into account overlap. And this is not something that is often being discussed, so let's spend a couple of minutes talking about it. And so what this basically means is that, as most of you probably know, most of the exercises in resistance training involve more than just one muscle group. So for example, most people know that when you do bench press, besides your chest, your anterior shoulders and your triceps also get stimulated. And so for example, if today I had shoulder training session and tomorrow I'm training chest, now the fatigue in my shoulders could be potentially limiting my performance during tomorrow's training session for chest. And on top of that, that training session will probably be interfering with the recovery of my shoulders from the training session that I had the day before. So hopefully it's pretty obvious how all that is not optimal. Now here I listed some of the muscle groups that have significant overlap in their training. And so we have legs and back, back and shoulders, shoulders and chest, chest and triceps, triceps and shoulders, and back and biceps. Now, one of the ways to deal with this would be to group related muscle groups together. So for example, legs push pull split would be a good example of that. But I personally don't like that very much, because first of all, when you group related muscle groups together, sometimes the assault could be too concentrated. So for example, if you ever train the legs and back together and you're utilizing heavy exercises such as squats, deadlifts, bend over rows, and so on, now that workout would be hell on your lower back. And then on top of that, grouping related muscle groups together makes their training very, very infrequent. So for example, if I'm training each body part only once a week, and then on top of that, I decided to train my chest, shoulders, and triceps together, now those muscle groups really get only one training session per week. And I don't like that very much. And that's why I like to spread it out a little more, because although that's a little more tricky, I feel like even if you still train each body part only once a week, but you spread it out properly, in reality what tends to happen is that each body part ends up having at least one more additional training session. So for example, if I am training my biceps on Thursday and I consider that to be my primary biceps training session, and on top of that I have a back training session on Monday, that would be like an analogy of a light training session for biceps. So you can see how I would be almost attaining some level of undulating loading, while in reality I'm still training each body part only once a week. And you can check out both of my hypertrophy phases to see how I'm navigating this. And it's a little tricky and you can never really get it perfect, but one of the main rules while navigating this is that you should never schedule these muscle groups, training sessions for these muscle groups on consecutive days. Now the second thing we're going to talk about is the volume. And the volume in bodybuilding is determined by the number of sets. Now it should be pretty obvious that this will depend greatly on the frequency of your training. Because if you're training 3 times a week, you're probably doing much less volume than if you train 6 times a week. And this is probably a good time for us to stop and point out how interrelated all these things are. And for that reason, I'm not providing you with any specific recommendations regarding to how many sets you should be doing per each body part. But instead we'll stick to general recommendations. And the way you split up the volume in bodybuilding is that the bigger the body part is, the more sets that body part will get. So you'll probably be doing a lot more work for your quads than for your biceps, for example. Now, another thing that you have to take into consideration is your weak and your strong areas. So for example, if you feel that your triceps is already ahead of the game, but your biceps is lagging behind, perhaps it would be a good idea for you to spend more time on your biceps and not as much on your triceps. And overlap is also have to be considered here, because if you remember, triceps also get stimulated during your chest training session and your shoulder training session. And if you feel that it's already far ahead of the game, perhaps you wouldn't even need too much additional work and you could put that energy to use somewhere else. Once we figure out the number of sets for a particular muscle group, now we have to decide on what exercises we're actually going to do. And here we want to take into account the fact that we want to target the same muscle group from different angles to ensure well-balanced development. So for example, when it comes to our shoulders, we want to make sure that we have some work for our anterior deltoids, for our lateral deltoids, and for our posterior deltoids. And here, once again, overlap has to be taken into account, because going back to our shoulder example, now we have to remember that our anterior deltoids get a lot of stimulation during the chest training. And so when it comes to our primary shoulder training session, perhaps we won't need much more additional work for that area. Now, another thing to take into account here is that the same muscle group can have various levels of development of its different parts. So for example, if our upper chest is lagging behind our lower chest, perhaps we can schedule more sets in exercises that target upper chest and fewer sets in exercises that target lower chest. The last one in the volume section is the MRV, maximum recoverable volume. This is something that is advocated by Mike Israetel, and roughly speaking what he states is that by trial and error we can all determine the optimum number of sets for different body parts and then utilize that information while creating a training program. Now I like this as a concept, but not so much when people start talking about specific numbers. And I think this is something that resonates with the current obsession with individualization of training. And it's kind of cool to say that MRV for my bicep is 7, but for my chest is 11. But in reality, there are just simply too many moving parts during training process for you to be able to make such claims. So for example, if I'm training 3 times a week while utilizing whole body routines and my biceps is all the way at the end of that training session, I might feel that MRV for my biceps is 3 sets. While on the other hand, if I'm training 6 times a week and my biceps gets its own training session, I might feel that MRV for my biceps is 30 sets. So I hope you can see my point. And I don't want to hate on this too much because at least somebody's trying to make sense in this field. And the only thing I would say is that use it as a concept, but don't get hung up too much on any specific numbers. We are finally down to the intensity. Now, the weights that you are using during your training session is considered to be a secondary thing in bodybuilding. And the intensity is measured by the subjective amount of effort. And most of your work sets will be taken to the failure. Now, here once again we have to remind ourselves that all these things are interrelated. And as you remember, when I had that graph here, we said that intensity will be inversely related to the volume. So if you're planning 30 sets for your back, you probably won't be able to go Dorian Yates, blood and guts on every single one of that. So this will require some sort of discretion on your part. And in order to combat that subjectivity, more and more recently you start seeing these two acronyms. So let's talk about what they actually mean. Now these two things are actually two sides of the same coin. So this stands for reps in reserve, and this is rate of perceived exertion. And this scale is from 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest, the maximum effort. Now let's imagine that there was a weight that I could only lift 5 times with my best effort. And if I lift that weight 5 times, my reps in reserve is 0 and my effort is 10, the maximum effort. Now if I lifted that weight 4 times, I left 1 rep in reserve and my effort is 9, and my RPE is 9. And if I lifted that weight 3 times, I left 2 reps in reserve and my RPE is 8. You see how that goes. Now, I'm more accustomed to the RPE, board RPE scale, which is on a scale from 6 to 20. And although that scale is a little more vague, I actually kind of prefer it because that kind of implies that at least some of it, that is a general recommendation and at least some of it is on you. While this is a little more specific. Now, although there is definitely utility to this, I think at the same time this can give you this false sense of precision, while in reality these things are still very much subjective. So for example, if I was to create a training program while using these things as guidelines and then present that training program to somebody who has type A personality and type B personality, their interpretation of the same training program would be wildly different. So just something to keep in mind, that most of these things are still very much subjective.